after another. And unless you were knowledgeable in the field, you wouldn't necessarily know that. So I found it regrettable from that perspective. Another way to put this is what you see on a website like Answers in Genesis compared to what you see from a researcher like Dr. Wise or Dr. Wood are different things. There's a public sort of perception, and then there's the academics who are actually working on the issues. This group has also, it's listed under a weakness, but this one isn't really so much a weakness as just a point for discussion. It could also be a strength. There's criticism between this group and other Christian groups in terms of their hermeneutical or exegetical approach, basically how they interpret and apply Scripture. So whether this is a strength or a weakness is really up for grabs. I should have really put this in a separate category and not given it as a weakness. This model also promotes what's called like a warfare or conflict approach between science and faith. Again, this, depending on how you look at it, is either a strength or a weakness. Certainly as a scientist, I see it as a weakness, but those within the community would see it as a strength. The issue is that science and faith are ways of knowing that are fundamentally in conflict with one another. And that's essentially what the approach that this model promotes. Any questions or comments at that point? I think that's the end of our... Oh, no. One more slide. Sorry. So, what do we say in response to all these things? This gets to the question that was asked just a little while ago. The consensus of an overwhelming number or proportion of biologists and other scientists is that scientific creationism or young Earth creationism does make testable predictions, but these predictions have been failed to be supported by experimentation. So as such, the vast majority of scientists consider young Earth creationism as a form of pseudoscience, or a form of what's called folk science. Pseudoscience?
Sorry, I just didn't hear you.
Okay, sure. Basically, it has the outward appearance and form of science, but in its core, it's not actually a scientific discipline. This idea of folk science, you'll see that discussed in some of those videos from Gordon Glover. Folk science is a term that was put forward by a physicist named Howard Van Til from Calvin some years ago. And he essentially was trying to find a nicer way of saying pseudoscience. Basically to say it's a form or an appearance of science that is used to justify a worldview to those who aren't academically able to critique it from a scientific perspective. Young Earth creationism or creation science in the U.S., it was declared unconstitutional to teach in the public school system in 1987 since it's not a scientific enterprise. So it was ruled that it does not have a place in scientific classrooms in the U.S. It's typically not taught in Canada. We have a slightly different landscape in terms of separation of church and state. You can find young Earth creationism taught in some areas of Alberta, because in some areas of Alberta there is a distinction. There's actually a subdivision within the school that there's a certain amount of time set aside as flex time that allows for instruction from a religious perspective. So you can actually get young Earth creationism taught as religion in some parts of Alberta. But our landscape is slightly different. Okay. Despite this, young Earth creationism as a model remains the predominant view in Christian schools and in the homeschooling movement. Most of the resources that you will see in the Christian homeschooling movement and most textbooks used in Christian schools approach these topics from a young Earth creationist perspective. I think that's it. All right, why don't we open it up for comments and questions at that point, now that you've been given an overview of this approach. So, questions and comments? I'm happy to answer any questions or concerns. To be honest, I don't particularly mind what approach you're coming from. Like I said before, the approach here is just to sort of lay it all out so you have an informed, so that you're informed on these topics. So I'm not out to change anybody's mind. I'm just trying to give full access to the relevant information. questions or comments? Yeah.
In Glover's videos,
Yeah.
I really appreciated you sending those out. I thought they were very concise and ordered and give a really good overview.
They're great little nuggets of like 10-minute kind of hard-hitting. Yeah.
And I appreciate that, and I guess coming from that, I mean, I appreciate a lot of things from reading up on this thing, but just understanding, taking natural science for what it is, and understanding that it's not to prove absolutes.
Yep.
And that, the object of natural science is not to prove that there is a God or to prove that there isn't a God, but to explain what we know exists in the natural, I mean, we have faith that these natural laws exist, but outside of that, that's not the object of natural science.
Right, and there's even a sense that these natural laws may well have their origin in a supernatural entity. That I certainly believe that to be the truth, but I don't come at it from that scientific approach. I don't think it's something that I can empirically test.
He talked about the proximate and the ultimate causality.
Right, yes.
And I think...
And that's the exact reason why I assigned that particular video, the distinction between a proximate cause, which is amenable to scientific investigation, where you have an ultimate cause which really goes beyond the view of science to answer. Yeah. And it's ironic how most Christians don't have a problem with many of those proximate causes listed in that video, right? We don't have a problem with the law of gravity doing its thing, even if it has its ultimate source in the laws that God set up when He designed the cosmos, right? We're not theologically threatened by that distinction in that case. Yeah, question?
I just have a question about pollen.
Yeah.
You said it doesn't, you can't find it after like the Jurassic.
Oh no, before, going down in the column. Yeah.
Yeah. But like, why is that?
Because flowering plants didn't exist at that time.
So flowering plants would be a product of evolution itself?
Yeah, the model is that flowering plants are essentially a late evolutionary adaptation that didn't crop up until that time.
Because it's like a form of survival for the plant.
Right. And so typically what you see before that are seedless plants, so mosses, ferns, and things like that. And the contrast with the pollen is what you'll see if you read the article are spores. Spores are similar to pollen, but they're produced by ferns, and those we see all over the place because ferns have been, according to the model, have been around for a long time. So the question then becomes, well, why can you find spores everywhere, but you can't find pollen except at this level up? And it's at the same exact level where you start to see the remains of flowering plants, whereas below you can't find remains, can't find fossils of flowering plants. Yeah. Darwin was actually puzzled by the sudden sort of, you get to a certain part of the fossil record, a certain layer, and then, wow, flowering plants are kind of everywhere. But then once you get below that, they're nowhere to be found. So, yeah. And that sort of abruptness that we're talking about, we're going to talk about that more when we talk about what's called Old Earth creationism. Old Earth creationism is the approach that essentially accepts the geological column for what it is, but still denies a certain level of biological continuity between species. They see it as independent creation events over a much longer period of time. Now, young earthers would find that a horrible suggestion, and that's sort of like the next model up is to talk about Old Earth creationism, how it fits in. So we'll revisit that issue later on. Yeah?
So do young earthers believe in evolution or no?
No, they absolutely reject it. Well, let me qualify that. It really depends on what you mean by evolution. They accept what they call a limited amount of common descent within an originally created kind. So they would say, okay, horses and zebras and donkeys, well, there might have been one original horse kind that was created, and what we see in biodiversity in that group now is the result of speciation after the flood. That's what they would propose. But they basically don't allow for very large, for any extent of continuity between different forms. They would say, yeah, dogs and horses certainly didn't ever share a common ancestor. There was an original dog kind, there was an original horse kind, but there's no relatedness between those two groups. Does that make sense? That's actually the kind of question that Dr. Wood is very interested in. He wants to, from a young Earth perspective, sort of draw the